Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen speaking. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. This one is titled The Real Dark Side of Hypnosis. I did a vlog a few weeks back, or a couple of months back, which I titled The Dark Side of Hypnosis, which got quite a bit of feedback and also quite a bit of interesting pushback. So I'd like to elaborate a little bit on this whole topic of the dark side of hypnosis. In my view, when people focus on what they think of as the dark side of hypnosis, they kind of make the same blunder often that conspiracy theorists often make in terms of talking about the dangers of big government and stuff like that. If you've ever looked into conspiracy theories, you'll see theories about chemtrails and 9/11 inside jobs and all sorts of stuff. And of course, these various theories might range from somewhat plausible to completely unrealistic. But while it's extremely important, in my view, to be skeptical of governments and state power and stuff like that, I think it often distracts from real, actual issues which there is a preponderance of evidence of. For example, a lot of people will talk about 9/11 conspiracy theories, but they won't necessarily talk about the actions of the United States in Chile and Nicaragua and Latin America. For example, the first 9/11, which happened 20 years earlier in Chile, which was a huge disaster. I mean, if you want to be skeptical of, for example, the United States government's foreign policies or politics, there are real documented cases with plenty of evidence that the conspiracy theorists never touch, never go near. So I don't think this is a conspiracy, but I think the emphasis on conspiracy theories often serves to distract from discussing issues that there really is solid evidence for. Same way with hypnosis. A lot of the theories that people have about Manchurian candidates and brainwashing and stuff like that, the evidence for that type of stuff is very weak. But there are actual dangers of not understanding hypnosis, of not understanding the double-edged sword of high hypnotizability, which goes virtually undiscussed. So I'd like to nudge your attention a little bit in that direction. Now, after the last podcast that I did, a few people offered some pushback in terms of, what about people getting indoctrinated into belief systems, whether that might be communist radicals or, Islamic fundamentalists or suicide bombers or whatever it might be. And a lot of people get indoctrinated into stupid ideologies. A lot of people can clearly be persuaded through either coercion or various forms of persuasions and social influence, and appeal to authority and conformity to do a lot of very unethical and very bad stuff. Now, whether hypnosis has anything to do with it, that is a different topic. I think a lot of people who talk about hypnosis really do the service or do the topic a disservice by not clearly defining their definitions and by not specifying which definitions that they operate from. Because some people's definitions of hypnosis are so vague and so all-encompassing that the term hypnosis really refers to everything and nothing, making it completely redundant. So, for example, there are terms such as persuasion, or indoctrination, or obedience to authority. Now, if you're going to use a term like hypnosis, the only justification for using that term is if what you're pointing to is not really addressed by those more common terms. So to me, let me really. So I'll give you a couple of examples. These might be some borderline examples. For example, salespeople who have read Robert Cialdini's book about influence know, for example, about the principle of internal consistency, meaning if you can get someone to say yes to, a sequence of requests, there's a larger chance that you'll get people to say yes to a bigger request. So, for example, there's this study cited where they ask people if they would be willing to, or the government asks people if they would be willing to have this huge freaking sign on their lawn telling people to drive safely or something around those lines. And the no rate is really, really high. Very few people say yes to this because it looks horrible. But then there's this experiment where people are asked first if they will have these like bumper stickers on their car urging people to drive safely. And then a few weeks later, they get asked whether they're willing to have that ugly sign on their lawn. And now the success rate or the yes rate is way, way higher. This is well known to persuaders. Is it hypnosis per se? No, at least not in the way that I think about it. There are other experiments of, for example, at college campuses where you might ask people if they're willing to engage in some sort of activity. Now, if people are told that the activity to be done, whether it's some sort of charitable work or something like that, starts at 7 in the morning, most people will say no. But if people first commit to being willing to do the work, and then they're told that it's at 7 in the morning, then you have a lot higher success rate. Again, are people persuaded? Yes. Is it hypnosis? To my mind, at least, no. This is covered by principles of persuasion. Or you can talk about social proof. If you're waiting at a red light and no cars, come, and some people begin to walk, a lot of other people will begin to walk. This is what Cialdini again refers to as social proof. Or, if you run a bar or a restaurant, you can use this principle of social proof to persuade, nudge, or influence quite a few people to give more tip. One way you could do it is that you could have like a bucket of money, where people give the tip, and you could have quite a bit of money in it. Now, if there's quite a bit of money in it, a lot more people will give more tip than if there's no money in it. Why? The principle of social proof. The bucket with the money kind of implies or suggests that most people give, or a lot of people give. So therefore, more people give money. Now, this is the principle of social proof in action. This one might be more of a borderline. Is there a hypnotic element to it? There's certainly a suggestion at play. Could you define this as hypnotic? Well, maybe, maybe not. Depending on a little bit upon, how you were to define hypnosis. So let me once again offer my definition so that everybody knows very clearly what I'm referring to and what I'm not referring to. This is so important. So I really like the definition that Herbert Spiegel used to use, which is hypnosis as a state of very focused attention, characterized by absorption, dissociation, and suggestibility. So when two people do hypnosis, one person is offering suggestions, the other person is getting absorbed into a suggested idea to the point where it's as real, and then the whole thing is experienced as fully non-volitional, as in I didn't do it. It's that experience of something being non-volitional as a response to or in relationship to a suggestion that makes something hypnotic. This being the case, during a hypnotic process, but also being the case in the case of a post-hypnotic suggestion, where someone might act out a suggestion based upon some cue, minutes, hours, weeks after the suggestion has been given, might feel compulsed to do it, might experience the behaviors as completely non-volitional, and if it's a fully hypnotic experience, has amnesia for the suggestion in the first place. This form of controlled dissociation or is to me kind of the gold standard of hypnosis. Someone being given suggestions and then later on, based upon particular cues, they're acting out the suggestion in an automatic way and having amnesia for the suggestion in the first place. This would be like the gold standard of hypnosis and the whole fantasy of the Manchurian Candidate. So in what I would call full hypnosis or extreme cases of hypnosis, you have the sense of something being non-volitional and the amnesia condition. At least for something to be called hypnotic, we need for something to be experienced as non-volitional in relation to a suggestion. This is what makes it hypnotic. Same also goes for indirect hypnosis. If someone comes into my office and they say, I freak out whenever I get behind the wheel of a car, I'd like to be more comfortable. If we mark that out as the topic to work with, and I tell them a bunch of metaphors and a bunch of stories that seemingly have no relationship whatsoever to driving in a car, but where the person unconsciously reorganizes their experience, makes sense out of suggestions, evokes resources, and then find themselves being calm, mastering driving the car when they're out in the real life context. This is an example of hypnosis. This is why in the last vlog, when I talked about the famous Milgram experiments of obedience and Philip Zimbardo's prison experiment, where I said, look, these are very interesting from a social psychology perspective. They're very interesting from the perspective of authority and obedience and stuff like that, but I don't really think of it as hypnosis. I don't necessarily think of the placebo effect or nocebo effect necessarily as hypnosis either. Although placebo and nocebo can qualify, depends a bit on how you again define it. So what could be some real examples of the dark side of hypnosis? Well, I'll give you a fun example. Many years ago, maybe 15 years ago, a client came into my office and she said that she was very depressed and she looked very depressed. And she told me this story about going to a medical doctor being frustrated, just frustrated. She moved to this new city, didn't have that many friends here, struggled getting a job, and her life seemed frustrating. Or she went to a psychiatrist, I should say. And the psychiatrist told her, "You're depressed." And she said, "No, I'm not depressed." "You are depressed. A lot of young people are depressed without knowing it. I'm the psychiatrist and you're depressed." And he essentially, while she was in a pretty emotional state, sold her the idea, the imprinted idea, that she was depressed. And she started going to therapy to work on her depression, and she ended up in this group with other depressed folks, kind of reinforcing the notion of her being depressed. And she told me this story, and I burst out laughing. I didn't laugh at her. I laughed because I thought it was so hysterically funny and obviously unethical, the whole thing. And I said something. I can't quite remember what. And I said, "I suggest you do this very simple task." And she essentially said, "Fuck you." And she ran out of the office, furious. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, that went well. That was a good piece of work. Then a couple of months later, she calls and says, "Thank you for not saving my life, but changing my life." And I was utterly confused. And she even said, that this might sound confusing. "Do you remember me?" And I was like, "Yeah, I remember you." And she said, "I was really, really angry with you for a few days, but then it hit me. It hit me because I trust you, I believe in you. So the fact that you were laughing when I told this story made me question, made me think that maybe my problems weren't so serious after all." And she kind of realized that the only reason she was depressed was because she had bought into this suggestion that she was depressed in the first place. So one expert sells the idea that she's depressed. The other expert, by implication, by laughter, kind of sells or implies the idea that she's not depressed. So this, to me, people accepting an imprint, accepting a suggestion about who they are or what their experience should be, given by a so-called expert in a moment of high emotion. This can very often function as a form of suggestion or form of hypnosis. John Grinder used to have a great story that he told about Virginia Satir, and John would call this an ethical content hypnosis, where he was sitting there watching Virginia Satir work with a family, and she would speak to this father who was very angry and kind of raging. And he would say, "You worked so hard for this family, and you're clearly angry, and you're frustrated, and you're this, and you're this." And she was kind of pacing his experience, what he had said. And then she looked at him very intently, and she said, "Now that you've expressed all that anger, are you willing to talk about the deep hurt that lies behind that anger?" And to everyone's surprise, everyone but Virginia, the guy started sobbing. Now, some people might think that, well, yeah, but the fact that he started sobbing is evidence that there must have been a deep hurt behind the anger. Where I thought John Grinder has a perfect counter argument, where he says, well, if you believe that necessarily to be the case, the people who quack like a duck then on stage in a stage hypnosis show must then have repressed urges to quack like a duck, which obviously is not the case. So I remember I went to a seminar back in 2008 called The Big Mind Process with a guy called Genpo Roshi. And this seminar illustrated to me a few of the dangers of not understanding hypnosis and hypnotic phenomena and suggestion, and also how naive a lot of people in the meditation world can be as a result of not having studied that. You know, all the talk about pure this and pure that, and how they're only just discovering these truths. Well, in addition to discovering, you know, a lot of it is constructed. A lot of it is suggested. So what happened during this Big Mind seminar was that it was a 2-day course in New York. The first day, a guy who actually had some NLP training was telling people stories and essentially suggesting to people that they had all these sub-personalities that could be evoked, and so on and so forth. So he was essentially suggesting and constructing for people all the stuff that people then, lo and behold, big surprise, discovered during the next day. People had a tendency to discover exactly what the NLP trained guy had suggested and set up the previous day. And people thought these were like, discovering parts of themselves or discovering their true nature. Whereas I, with my hypnosis background, could see like, oh my God, these people are acting upon suggestion and constructing way more than they are discovering. So this is a potential dark side of hypnosis. And if you look at high hypnotizability, I think very often when talking about hypnosis and the dark side, instead of talking about hypnosis per se as a ritual, what you want to look at is high hypnotizability, the people who have a high capacity for dissociation, for suggestibility, and for absorption. The people who can very easily get absorbed into ideas in a kind of experienced as non-volitional way, these people can buy into some pretty wacky stuff given the right context. These are contexts where their high hypnotizability, instead of being a gift, can really work against them. And I'll give you a very strong example of this: multiple personality disorder. It's not about trauma. It's the whole idea that people were so traumatized that their personality had to split off into various parts is all bunk. Multiple personality disorder is entirely generated by suggestion. It's suggestion created in therapy with highly hypnotizable folks, and with therapists who most of the time have no clue what they're doing and not understanding what they're doing. So what would happen during the MPD craze, or back in the day when multiple personalities were in vogue, was that you had a lot of therapists who had the idea, somewhat based upon old Freudian theories of repression and stuff like that, that if someone was very traumatized, then their memories and parts of their psyche might become repressed, and that if people had certain symptoms, then that might be indicative of some form of repression. So the idea then became that you had to call out these parts, these kind of repressed parts. So therapists would suggest these alters or these personality parts. This didn't come from the clients. It came from the therapists. The therapists would suggest this to be the case and offer this repression theory as the rationale, and then they would begin to call out the parts. Sometimes using hypnosis, other times not necessarily using hypnotic processes, but calling out the parts and inquiring people to speak from the part and to name anything that appeared as this personality part and kind of become that part. And of course, with people who have a high ability for absorption and suggestibility and dissociation, the people who you could do hypnosis with and where you could suggest that later on when I, tug my tie, you'll feel an urge to take off your shoes and this and that, and you'll have complete amnesia for, people like that who might enact that suggestion and have complete amnesia. This is profound dissociation. This is a highly hypnotizable person. This is a form of influence that is not referred to in terms like persuasion or indoctrination or stuff like that. This is where a term like hypnosis points to something kind of different. So people with that type of capacity, what would very often happen was that these people would enact the suggestion. They would create these, call it parts, and be completely amnesic from one part to the other. Not because they really operate that way, but because that was what was sold as the framework. So the fact that people could have so convincing experiences was evidence to therapists and people around them that it had to be real. These so-called multiple personality parts, had to not be created or suggested, but actually discovered. Now, of course, as the media started writing about this madness, with the book, was it 3 Faces of Sybil or whatever the book was, based upon this very famous patient, then it became in vogue. So people, would come to therapists kind of developing these symptoms not only as a result of the therapist's suggestions, but as a result of media suggestions. And you kind of got an epidemic of it. And what, of course, would also happen with these highly hypnotizable folks was that they would often end up in treatment programs where you have these other multiple personality folks, and where, staff would talk to them as if they had multiple personalities. So you have this like reinforcement system where everything's set up this hypnotically induced game. Now the cure, so to speak, I'll put cure in quotation marks because there's no actual disease anywhere, to multiple personality disorder was very, very simple. And that was to take people out of these therapy groups, to no longer imply or suggest or treat them as if they had multiple personalities, to completely change the terminology, to no longer talk about alters. So remove them from the social context and essentially remove all the suggestions, and people would revert back to their, I'll put in quotation marks, normal self. Now, when the media started writing more critically about this, and insurance companies that didn't want to sponsor treatments around this. This was like back in the year 2000. This is when like the MPD, multiple personality craze, those people went into the whole PTSD business, which is another business where you have a lot of highly hypnotizable folks acting out a lot of weird suggestions. As a topic for a different podcast. But after like the year 2000, this craze dramatically dropped off. So this is an example of an area where high hypnotizability and hypnotic interventions have done a lot of harm. I will assume mostly by people who don't understand suggestion, who don't understood what they were doing. And another instance of this is the memory wars of the 80s and 90s. This is perhaps the biggest scandal in modern psychology and psychiatry, just because it was so huge, and it affected so many people, and it split apart thousands, if not tens and thousands of families in numerous countries, and untold innocent people have been charged with abuse they've never done, and horribly, plenty of people have been sent to jail as rapists, as pedophiles, based upon false memories created in therapy. This is just horrendous. Of course, a lot of the basis for this, and I'll do a separate vlog on this to really get into the psychology. Here I just want to talk about the hypnotic element of it, which I, for the most part, suspect wasn't that big, but we have to admit that hypnotic procedures and rituals and high hypnotic capacity has been a solid player in this. So if you had a therapist, let's say somebody came to a therapist who had all these ideas about repressed memories in relationship to sexual abuse, and that certain symptoms or problems in living were evidence of sexual abuse, and of course, then they would suggest to the person that, this indicates that you've been abused. And if you feel like you've been abused, even if you can't remember it, that's evidence that you were abused. So people would be, put in these groups where they would talk to other people who had discovered abuse. They would be given pen and paper and be asked to draw, use their intuition, imagine what it would be like, how could it be like. And every time they discovered something, felt something, they would get applauded. The behavior would be, reinforced and rewarded. And of course, for a lot of people, this was very attractive, because if you're at a certain age and you have a sense of entitlement and you have something of a victim attitude, and your life hasn't turned out quite the way you wanted to, that cognitive dissonance that can easily result from the interplay of being kind of entitled and perhaps a bit narcissistic, and not having quite achieved what one wanted to achieve, well, what more attractive than finding these repressed abuse memories, which then become the alibi for a life that, hasn't quite been what one expected to do. One is completely off the hook. So there's a lot of social or psychological factors at play for this. But of course, when you then had therapists who might do hypnotic processes, or even just asking questions, let's say someone's remembering a memory and they say, "My father's hugging me." Now, if the therapist would say, "Can you feel how your father is touching you in a way that he shouldn't?" If the person is very suggestible and has a motive to buy into the process, the mind can now easily generate a memory, an experience of that being the case. And suddenly that's proof. So, of course, especially with highly hypnotizable folks, where there's a lot less reality testing, people who were motivated to find abuse, who bought into the framework, who were suggestible and had a high capacity for dissociation, would often stun themselves and their therapists by discovering, either gradually or suddenly, these dramatic, horrible experiences of abuse. And then the drama and the perceived realness of it was taken as further evidence that the abuse must have happened. So that capacity for dissociation and that capacity to kind of sidestep current filters and completely buy into a suggested reality without much reality testing. That, compared with the often high levels of trust in highly hypnotizable people, combine those things and put them in a therapeutic environment where everybody is reinforcing them and treating them as special and reinforcing and rewarding their discoveries. This can be very, very dangerous. So this is a very real, well-documented aspect of high hypnotizability and also hypnotic interventions done by people with kind of feminist ideologies / some Freudian theories of repression into the mix. Highly, highly dangerous. Of course, a final one, if you look at false confessions, and I'm going to do a vlog on this too. If you look at false confessions in the legal system, if you have a young person with trust in authority who has not done the murder or done anything wrong, but he trusts the police, and then the police says, we have evidence. The police is lying essentially, but we have evidence, we have proof, we have this, everything shows that you've done this, but I can't remember. So now the person's in a bind because they trust the police, but they can't remember. So the police then might offer this idea that the good you, the real you, would never do that type of stuff. It's because you have a conscience that you had to repress the horrible acts. And then they kind of put a lot of pressure on the person, make sure that the person remains in short-term thinking, offers an idea, offers them kind of a, it wasn't that, they offer them the idea that they're still a good person, and the fact that they can't remember means that they're a good person, and that they're doing the right thing for themselves and everyone else involved. Now, for a highly hypnotizable person who buys into this framework, there might be a higher chance that the mind then creates a memory of having committed the murder, which is completely convincing to them subjectively by its intensity and by its vividness and by its realness, so to speak. So these are examples. The false confessions, the false memories, multiple personality disorders, and the fixed ideas that people can accept when they're in a very emotional state, and where people often feel an anxiety when they try to violate that suggestion. You have, for example, classic examples of people who have had chronic pain where the doctor, to a very suggestible client during a moment of high stress, says, you'll just have to learn to live with this. And then if the person later on gets rid of the pain, they suddenly have this overwhelming fear of death. And this is suggestion-based, because the implication is you'll just have to live with this. The implication meaning, if you ever get rid of this, you're dead. So pain is a way of knowing that you're still alive. You have these sorts of funky ideas. So if you're going to talk about the dark side of hypnosis, I think you have to be very precise in your definitions, and I think you have to, when you use the term hypnosis, to make sure that you're not discussing stuff that easily falls into the category of social pressure or conformity or believe in authority or indoctrination or persuasion. So that's about it. I should say that a psychologist contacted me after my first vlog and said that I was wrong about the Manchurian Candidate thing. where my perspective is based upon the John Marx's book, that I don't think the Manchurian Candidate thing is plausible. Highly hypnotizable folks and suggestibility. It's way too unstable to be reliable. Where he said that he had worked in the army and been part of projects like this as a psychologist in the army, where he said that the success rate had been maybe something like 2%, meaning people who had killed other people. So he said that this happened, and it happened in several countries. Now, I don't know him well. I sense that he was probably telling the truth. But they were looking for, often drug dealers, and not drug dealers, but people who were addicted to drugs and people who had a lot of problems. And I would assume, drugs and hypnosis are generally not a good combination. These were long-term projects, over months, where the person would be persuaded to kill someone on order from the army, and these people would, of course, often disappear later. This type of this type of stuff apparently happens in civilized societies all over the place. I would still, based upon the descriptions that he gave me, open for the possibility that I might be wrong, open for the fact that there might have been real Manchurian candidates who were like hypnotically programmed to do their assassination. So maybe I'm wrong. Based upon the person's descriptions, I don't know how hypnotic the whole thing was. It seemed to be more a case of coercion and social pressure and rewards and things better explained by a combination of coercion and persuasion than hypnosis per se. Anyways, hope this gave you some food for thought, that it provoked you a little bit, shook up some of your assumptions, and till next time.